The Marshall Mansion's modern architecture stood in stark contrast to the setting sun, its glass walls reflecting the orange glow. Inside his home office, David Marshall watched his daughter Emma through the security feed. The 17-year-old sat in her room, surrounded by ring lights and expensive camera equipment, her fingers moving rapidly across her phone screen. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. David checked the numbers on his tablet. Emma's latest post had garnered 50,000 likes in just 30 minutes. Her face lit up with each notification, the blue light from her phone casting an artificial glow on her features. She hadn't left her room in 6 hours, except for a quick bathroom break and to grab a protein shake. "Mr. Marshall, the board members are ready for you." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. In the conference room, 12 executives sat around a mahogany table. PowerPoint slides displayed various graphs showing the Marshall Tech's market performance. However, David's attention kept drifting to the small window on his laptop showing Emma's live stream. "Our quarterly numbers are strong," reported Sarah Chen, the CFO, "but there's growing concern about our public image. The younger demographic sees us as another soulless tech giant." David barely registered her words. On his screen, Emma was unboxing luxury items, her perfectly manicured nails tearing through expensive packaging while spouting rehearsed enthusiasm. The comment section exploded with heart emojis. "Mr. Marshall," Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "Sorry," he straightened in his chair. "You were saying about our public image." "Yes, we need to consider how the Marshall family presents itself. Your daughter's social media presence, while impressive in numbers, might not align with our company's vision of responsible technology use." The boardroom fell silent. Everyone knew discussing the CEO's daughter was dangerous territory. "Show me the demographic breakdown," David requested, his voice tight. The next slide revealed that 70% of Emma's followers were teenage girls between 13 and 16. Activity metrics showed they spent an average of 4 hours daily engaging with her content. David thought about Emma's mother, Catherine, who had passed away 5 years ago. She would have known how to handle this situation. Catherine had always emphasized the importance of real connections over virtual ones. After the meeting, David made his decision. In his office, he pulled up a property listing in Colorado, a small house in a remote village called Pine Ridge. Population 842. Average internet speed, barely enough for basic email. When he entered Emma's room that evening, she was editing a video, her dinner untouched beside her. "We need to talk," David announced, unplugging her main router. Emma's head snapped up. "Dad, I was in the middle of a stream." "That's exactly what we need to discuss." He sat on her bed, pushing aside a pile of designer clothes, still with tags attached. "You're going to spend some time away from all this." "What do you mean?" Emma's hand clutched her phone protectively. "I've arranged for you to stay in Colorado for a while, a small village called Pine Ridge." Emma laughed, then realized he wasn't joking. "You can't be serious. I have contracts, brand deals. My followers will survive without daily updates about your lunch choices." David's tone left no room for argument. Emma jumped up, her phone already recording. "You guys won't believe what my dad is doing." David reached over and switched off the house's backup internet connection. Emma's live stream cut to black. "This isn't a discussion," he stated firmly. "You leave next week. Pack warm clothes. They don't have designer boutiques in Pine Ridge." Emma's face reddened. "This is about control, isn't it? You can't stand that I've built something of my own. This is about saving you from becoming exactly what our technology was never meant to create. Someone who can't distinguish between real life and filtered perfection." He left her room as she shouted about her rights and her brand. Through the door, he heard objects being thrown and angry sobs. David returned to his office, pulled up the Pine Ridge property listing again, and clicked purchase. The next morning, Emma's social media accounts exploded with a final post. Being kidnapped by my own father. No internet in prison. See you never. The post got 100,000 sympathy likes before David had their internet service completely disconnected. The black Range Rover looked out of place on Pine Ridge's unpaved main street. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her designer boots propped against the dashboard, deliberately scuffing the leather. The private security driver David had hired maintained his professional silence as they passed wooden buildings that looked like they belonged in a Western movie. Local residents stopped their activities to stare at the vehicle. An elderly man in overalls paused while sweeping his store's porch. Two women carrying grocery bags whispered to each other. A group of teenagers on bicycles pointed openly. "We've arrived at the residence, Miss Marshall," the driver announced, pulling up to a modest two-story house. It was well maintained, but practically ancient by Emma's standards. The wraparound porch creaked under her weight as she stepped up, dragging her Louis Vuitton suitcase through the dust. "Your father arranged for Mrs. Henderson next door to check in on you," the driver informed her, depositing her remaining bags. "She has the spare key in case of emergencies." Emma didn't respond. She just stood there, taking in her new prison. The house had actual wooden shutters, not decorative ones, real, functional shutters that probably needed to be closed when it stormed. The garden was overgrown with wildflowers, instead of carefully manicured roses like at home. The driver left without ceremony. The sound of the Range Rover's engine fading away felt like the final string connecting her to civilization being cut. Inside, Emma discovered her father's idea of basic accommodation. A furnished house with functioning appliances but no smart home features. No high-speed internet, just enough for email, as promised, and a basic flip phone for emergencies. Her smartphone had been confiscated before leaving. She spent the first hour checking every room for hidden cameras or monitoring devices, convinced this was some sort of social experiment. Finding none, she slumped onto the living room couch, its floral pattern offending her aesthetic sensibilities. By late afternoon, hunger drove her outside. The local grocery store turned out to be a general store that sold everything from milk to fishing tackle. The bell above the door announced her entrance like a town crier. "You must be David's girl," the shopkeeper said without preamble. "Welcome to Pine Ridge. We don't get many city folks here." Emma grabbed a basket and filled it with the closest approximations to her usual, organic, gluten-free diet that she could find. The shopkeeper's attempts at small talk were met with monosyllabic responses. On her way back, she took a wrong turn and ended up near what appeared to be an auto repair shop. The sound of metal on metal rang out from the open garage door. Despite herself, Emma peered inside. A young man in his early 20s was bent over the engine of an old pickup truck. His plain white t-shirt was stained with grease, and his dark hair fell across his forehead as he worked. Without looking up, he called out, "Take a picture, it'll last longer." Emma bristled, as if I wouldn't waste my storage space. Now he did look up, revealing features that would have gotten decent engagement on her fashion posts. But his expression was anything but model-esque. It held a mixture of amusement and challenge. "You must be the exile," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm Jake Cooper. How does everyone already know who I am? Small town. News travels faster than internet around here." He grinned. "Plus, your arrival in that fancy SUV wasn't exactly subtle." Emma turned to leave, but Jake's next words stopped her. "Hey, princess. Want to see something that'll really offend your delicate sensibilities?" She should have kept walking. Instead, she found herself following him to his truck. 20 minutes later, they were bouncing along a dirt road that wound up into the mountains. Emma clutched the door handle, certain that each bump would be their last. The truck finally stopped at the edge of a crystal-clear lake. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still snow-capped despite the summer heat. The water reflected the sky like nature's mirror. "No signal up here," Jake announced, clearly pleased with himself. Not a single bar, just pure, unfiltered reality. Emma pulled out her flip phone, confirming his statement. "And this is supposed to impress me?" "No," Jake replied, heading toward a well-worn path along the shoreline. "This is supposed to remind you that there's a whole world that exists without needing your approval or anyone else's likes." Emma stood there, holding her useless phone, watching Jake's retreating figure. For the first time since arriving, she felt something besides anger, a tiny spark of curiosity about what else this backwoods town might be hiding. The late afternoon sun turned the lake to gold, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle called. "No filters needed," a small voice in her head whispered. She quickly silenced it, but followed Jake along the path anyway. Her designer boots, it turned out, were terrible for hiking. 2 weeks into her exile, Emma found herself sitting on a log around a bonfire with a group of locals. The flames cast dancing shadows on their faces as Mason, an elderly resident, told stories about the town's history. Her designer jeans had dirt on the knees from helping Sarah, a local artist, plant tomatoes earlier that day. "You should have seen Pine Ridge 30 years ago," Mason said, poking the fire with a stick. "Before the tech boom changed everything in the cities, we were actually the more advanced community in some ways. Had our own research facility up in the mountains." Emma leaned forward despite herself. "Research facility? Here? Marshall Advanced Technologies?" Mason nodded. "Your father's first real venture, before he moved operations to Silicon Valley. Worked there myself for 15 years. The group fell silent, and Emma noticed several people exchanging glances. Jake, sitting across the fire, caught her eye briefly before looking away. "What kind of research?" Emma asked, surprising herself with her genuine interest. Mason seemed to choose his words carefully. "Bit of everything. Alternative energy, communications, systems, environmental projects. Your father had big dreams for this place." Then Richard Blake showed up. Richard Blake. The name sounded familiar. "Your father's old partner," Sarah chimed in. "Before Marshall Tech became what it is today, they had different visions for the company." Emma pulled her knees to her chest, remembering the name from business news headlines. Blake Technologies was one of her father's main competitors now. "Different visions is putting it mildly," Mason snorted. Blake wanted to take the company in a more aggressive direction. Saw dollar signs where your father saw innovation opportunities. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Emma's mind stayed on Mason's words. As the evening progressed, she found herself relaxing into the group's dynamic. Lucy, a high school senior, taught her how to make the perfect s'more. Tom, who ran the local diner, shared embarrassing stories about Jake's teenage years that had everyone laughing. Later that night, as the fire died down to embers, Emma's flip phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number lit up the tiny screen. "Missing your spotlight, yet influencer. Your father's empire isn't as solid as he thinks." The warm feeling from the evening evaporated. Emma's hands shook slightly as she deleted the message. "Everything okay?" Jake appeared beside her, making her jump. "Fine," she said quickly, shoving the phone into her pocket. "Just tired." Jake studied her face for a moment. "You know, for someone who made a career out of being watched, you're not great at hiding your emotions." Emma stood up abruptly. "I don't need psychology from a small-town mechanic." "No," Jake agreed, frustratingly unfazed by her attitude. "But you might need a friend who can tell when something's wrong." The genuine concern in his voice made her throat tight. She'd had thousands of followers, but when was the last time someone had actually noticed how she felt rather than how she looked? The walk home gave Emma time to think. The text message weighed on her mind, but so did other things, like how Lucy had asked for her help with the town's upcoming festival without once mentioning her follower count, how Sarah had praised her eye for color combinations in the garden without knowing about her fashion influencer status, how Jake kept challenging her assumptions without making her feel stupid. In her borrowed house, Emma found herself opening her laptop and, for the first time since arriving, checking her email instead of trying to find ways around the social media blocks. There were hundreds of messages from sponsors, followers, and her agent, all marked urgent. She started to feel the familiar anxiety of being offline, of missing opportunities, of losing relevance. Then she remembered Mason's story about her father's early days, about having a vision beyond just profit margins and engagement rates. She thought about the text message and its ominous tone. There was something happening here, something bigger than her forced social media detox. A knock at the door startled her. Through the window, she saw Jake's truck idling in the driveway. He stood on the porch, holding up a paper bag. "Brought you some of Tom's apple pie," he called through the door. "Best cure for whatever's keeping you up at night." Emma hesitated, then opened the door. "I don't eat sugar after 8. "Right." Jake rolled his eyes. "And I bet you don't usually help plant vegetables or sit around campfires either." Yet here we are. The pie was still warm. They ate it straight from the bag, sitting on her porch steps, while Jake pointed out constellations she'd never been able to see through city lights. Neither mentioned her earlier outburst or the way her hands had shaken around the phone. But when Jake left, Emma found herself researching Richard Blake and Marshall Tech's early days. Her influencer empire feeling increasingly distant and somehow less important than the mystery developing around her. In his Silicon Valley office, David Marshall stared at his computer screen, his jaw tightening. The email from his security team contained screenshots of Richard Blake's latest moves, coordinated social media attacks, planted news stories, and carefully orchestrated leaks about Marshall Tech's supposed ethical violations. But what caught his attention was a draft article scheduled for release in a major tech magazine. Marshall Tech Heiress: the hidden story behind Emma Marshall's digital exile. The preview showed candid photos of Emma in Pine Ridge, clearly taken without her knowledge. David's phone rang. "Sir," his head of security reported, "Blake's people are positioning this as a whistleblower story. They're claiming you sent Emma away to hide corporate misconduct, using her social media influence as a cover story. How did they even know where she is?" David demanded. "Blake has connections in Pine Ridge from the old days. And sir, there's more. We've detected unusual activity around the old research facility." David's coffee went cold as he processed the implications. The facility had been officially shut down years ago, but it still contained servers with sensitive data from Marshall Tech's early days. Data that, in the wrong hands, could be devastating. Meanwhile, in Pine Ridge, Emma sat in Jake's garage, watching him work on an old Chevy while she shared what she'd discovered about Blake. "It doesn't make sense," she said, perched on a workbench. "Why would someone like Blake care about a small-town research facility that's been closed for years?" Jake slid out from under the car. "Maybe it's not about the facility. Mason says your dad and Blake had different ideas about technology's role in society. Blake wanted to monetize everything, turn every interaction into data that could be sold. Like social media," Emma realized, thinking about her own role in the digital economy. "Exactly. Your dad wanted technology to connect people, not exploit them. That's why he chose Pine Ridge for his first facility. He wanted to develop tech that would help small communities thrive without losing their soul." Emma's flip phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "Your father's legacy is built on lies. Want to know the truth about why he really sent you away?" RB Jake noticed her expression. Another message. Before she could respond, Sarah burst into the garage. "You need to see this," she said, holding up a tablet. A news alert showed Emma's face under the headline, "Tech Heiress's Social Media Empire, a Front for Corporate Corruption. They're trying to use me against Dad," Emma whispered. Jake wiped his hands and stood up. "Then we don't let them." Over the next few hours, Emma's borrowed house became an impromptu war room. Jake called in favors from friends with various skills. Lucy, who ran the high school newspaper, brought her journalism experience. Tom offered his diner as a secure meeting place. Its ancient cash register and lack of Wi-Fi made it practically hack-proof. Blake's playing a digital game, Jake said, spreading out a map of the area. But we have something he doesn't. Real people, real connections. And the truth, added Mason, who'd joined them after hearing the news. I was there in the early days. I know what really happened between David and Richard. Emma looked around the room at these people who'd gone from strangers to allies in just a few weeks. Blake thinks he can use my online presence against Dad, but he doesn't understand what I've learned here. Sometimes the most powerful messages don't need a filter or a hashtag. They worked late into the night, developing a plan that combined old-school community organizing with Emma's understanding of media dynamics. Lucy mapped out local connections, while Tom coordinated with other business owners. Sarah, whose art studio doubled as a community center, offered it as a base of operations. We need to show people the real Marshall Tech story, Emma said, her influencer instincts shifting into new territory. Not through sponsored posts or viral campaigns, but through the actual impact it's had on real communities like Pine Ridge. The summer festival is next week, Jake pointed out. The whole town will be there, plus visitors from neighboring communities. If we're going to make a stand, that's our chance. As the group dispersed, Jake hung back. You okay? This is a lot to process. Emma looked at the wall where they'd mapped out their strategy. I spent years building an image online, carefully controlling every detail. Now Blake thinks he can use that same approach to destroy my father's work. The difference is, your father built something real here, Jake said. All Blake has are algorithms and artificial engagement. Emma's phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't feel the same anxiety. Looking around at the empty coffee cups, scattered notes, and determined faces of her new allies, she realized she'd found something her millions of followers had never given her, a genuine purpose. Blake thinks he's dealing with an influencer, she said, a plan forming in her mind. Let's show him what real influence looks like. The Pine Ridge Community Center buzzed with activity as Emma stood on a ladder, helping Sarah hang locally made banners. The summer festival, traditionally a small-town affair, was being transformed into something bigger, a showcase of how technology and community could coexist without exploitation. My followers used to watch me unbox luxury items, Emma said, securing a corner of the banner. Now they're going to see something actually worth sharing. Sarah nodded toward the entrance, where Jake was unloading boxes of old photographs and documents from Mason's personal archives. Your father's early work here wasn't just about creating new technology. It was about preserving ways of life while making them sustainable. Emma climbed down and surveyed the room. Local artisans were setting up displays, showing how Marshall Tech's early innovations had helped their traditional crafts survive. Tom had dug up receipts, showing how the research facility had supported local businesses. Lucy interviewed elderly residents about the town's transformation during the Marshall years. Jake approached, wiping sweat from his forehead. You should see this, he said, holding out a yellowed photograph. It showed a younger David Marshall standing with Richard Blake outside the research facility. They were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders, like brothers. Hard to believe they were once friends, Emma murmured. More than friends, Mason said, joining them. Richard was your godfather, Emma. Not many people know that anymore. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Before she could process it, her phone buzzed. The message made her blood run cold. Family secrets always come out, goddaughter. Tomorrow's headlines will be interesting. RB Jake read the message over her shoulder. He's planning something for the festival. Let him, Emma said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. We'll be ready. Throughout the day, the preparation continued. Sarah's teenage son, a computer enthusiast, helped set up a simple live stream system. Nothing fancy, just genuine and unfiltered. Local musicians practiced songs that had been written about the town's history. The high school robotics club started with a grant from Marshall Tech, prepared demonstrations. During a break, Emma found Jake in his garage, working on something under a tarp. What's this? He pulled back the covering to reveal an old computer terminal from the research facility. Mason helped me salvage it. Still works. Why is this important? Because, Jake said, powering it up, this machine contains the original code your father and Blake wrote together. The foundation of Marshall Tech, before Blake wanted to turn it into a data mining operation. Emma watched the green text scroll across the ancient screen. We could use this at the festival. Show people the real vision behind Marshall Tech. As the sun set, Emma sat on her porch steps, feeling both exhausted and energized. Her phone showed dozens of notifications about trending hashtags. Hashtag Emma Marshall exposed. Hashtag Marshall Tech scandal. Hashtag Tech heiress secret. Jake's truck pulled up. He sat beside her without speaking, just offering silent support. I used to think influence meant having the most followers, Emma said finally. The perfect posts, the right sponsors. But that's not real influence, is it? Real influence, Jake replied, is inspiring people to act, to care, to make things better, like your father did here. Emma leaned back, looking at the stars. When I first came here, I thought Dad was punishing me, but he was trying to show me something. The same thing Blake couldn't understand. That technology should serve community, not replace it. Inside, her laptop pinged with an email alert. Blake's PR team had released their first wave of attacks. Articles questioning Marshall Tech's environmental impact, suggesting corporate espionage, hinting at hidden technological dangers. But Emma didn't feel the panic she expected. Instead, she felt a strange calm. Tomorrow, during the festival, she would show the world a different story. Not through carefully curated posts or sponsored content, but through the real lives of real people. Blake thinks he can destroy Dad's legacy by exposing secrets, she said to Jake. But the real secret is that Marshall Tech's strength isn't in its stock price or market share. It's in places like Pine Ridge, in people like you and Sarah and Mason. Jake stood up, offering her his hand. Then let's make sure everyone sees that tomorrow. As they walked back to the community center for final preparations, Emma's phone buzzed one last time. Hope you're ready for the spotlight, goddaughter. Tomorrow's show will be unforgettable. RB, she typed back her first response to any of his messages. For once, Richard, we agree on something. It will be unforgettable. The night before the festival, Pine Ridge hummed with anticipation. In houses across town, people prepared their parts in Emma's plan. And in her borrowed house, the influence she'd spent years cultivating online was being transformed into something far more powerful. The ability to reveal truth through community action. The morning of the festival dawned clear and bright. By 9 a.m., Pine Ridge's main street was transformed. Local news vans had arrived, drawn by the buzz surrounding Blake's leaked stories about Marshall Tech. But what they found wasn't a scandal, it was a celebration. Emma stood on the community center's steps, watching people stream in. She'd traded her designer clothes for jeans and a simple Pine Ridge High School t-shirt Lucy had given her. Her usual carefully styled hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Local news is already live streaming, Jake reported, joining her. And look who else showed up. A sleek black car had pulled up across the street. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his silver hair and confident stride immediately recognizable from tech magazine covers. Richard Blake himself. Didn't expect him to show his face, Emma muttered. He wants to watch his plan unfold in person, Jake said. Too bad he's about to watch it backfire instead. Inside the community center, their preparations were paying off. Mason led tours through the historical display, showing how Marshall Tech's early innovations had helped modernize local farms without destroying traditional farming methods. Sarah's art students demonstrated how technology enhanced their crafts rather than replacing them. The old computer terminal Jake had restored drew particular interest. This, he explained to a group of visitors, contains the original Marshall Blake code. See these comments in the programming. They show the philosophical divide between the founders. Marshall wanted to enhance human connection, Blake wanted to monetize it. Local and social media began picking up the story, but not the one Blake had planned. Instead of corporate scandal, they found human interest, a tech giant's forgotten roots in small-town innovation, preserved by the community itself. Emma's phone buzzed constantly with notifications, but not from her usual social media accounts. These were messages from reporters wanting to know more about Marshall Tech's community-first approach, about the real reason she was in Pine Ridge. Then came Blake's countermove. The community center's screens suddenly flickered to life, hijacked by an external signal. Blake's media team had prepared a slick video, carefully edited footage of Emma's most superficial social media moments, interspersed with suggestions of corporate misconduct. The final segment showed the old research facility, suggesting it held dark secrets about Marshall Tech's true purposes. But Emma was ready. She grabbed the microphone. "Mr. Blake," she called out, her voice carrying across the now silent room. "Since you're here, why don't you explain something to everyone?" Blake turned, his practiced media smile in place. "Emma, dear goddaughter, I'm just making sure the truth comes out." The truth. Emma pressed a button, and Jake's restored terminal displayed its contents on the main screen. Like how the original Marshall Blake code specifically prohibited data mining without user consent, the feature you later added after forcing my father out. Blake's smile faltered. Mason stepped forward, holding up old photographs. "Or should we discuss the real reason you left Pine Ridge? How about the board meeting where you proposed turning the research facility into a data collection hub, monitoring small towns without their knowledge?" The local news cameras swung toward Blake, who maintained his composure but couldn't quite hide his surprise at the organized resistance. "You're manipulating the narrative," Blake accused Emma, "just like you do with your millions of followers." "No," Emma replied calmly. "For the first time, I'm sharing something real." She gestured around the room. "These people, this community, they taught me what my father knew all along. Technology should serve humanity, not the other way around." Blake's phone chimed. His face darkened as he read the screen. The video he'd planted was being overwhelmed by live streams from the festival, showing the real story of Marshall Tech's impact on Pine Ridge. "You don't understand what's at stake," Blake said, his voice low and threatening. "I know things about your father, about this town, about the research facility." "Speaking of the facility," Jake interrupted, "want to explain why your people have been trying to access its servers recently? The ones containing evidence of your attempted corporate espionage 20 years ago." Blake's composure cracked. He reached for his phone, presumably to call reinforcements. But Emma wasn't finished. "You tried to use my social media presence against my father," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But you forgot something. Influence isn't just about followers and likes. It's about truth, community, and genuine connection. Everything you never understood about technology's real purpose." The room erupted in applause. Local residents stepped forward, sharing their own stories about Marshall Tech's positive impact on their lives. The news cameras captured it all. Blake retreated to his car, but not before issuing one final threat. "This isn't over, goddaughter. Some secrets can't be buried in feel-good community stories." As he drove away, Jake put his hand on Emma's shoulder. "You okay?" Emma watched the festival continuing around her. The genuine interaction between technology and community that her father had always envisioned. "He's right about one thing. It's not over. But maybe that's good. Maybe it's time for the real story of Marshall Tech to be told." Her phone buzzed with a message from her father, watching the live stream. "You've understood what I've been trying to tell you all along. But be careful. Blake won't give up easily." 3 days after the festival, Emma sat in Tom's diner reviewing news coverage on her laptop. The story had evolved beyond Blake's attempted scandal, focusing instead on the contrast between big tech's promises and Marshall Tech's actual community impact. But something was still bothering her. "Your coffee's getting cold," Jake said, sliding into the booth across from her. "What's wrong?" Blake's last threat, Emma replied. He seemed too confident, even after we exposed his attempted server breach. The diner's door chimed. A woman in an expensive business suit entered, looking out of place among the regular breakfast crowd. Emma recognized her immediately. Victoria Chen, Blake Technologies' Chief Operating Officer. "Miss Marshall." Victoria approached their table. "Mr. Blake would like to meet with you, privately." Jake started to object, but Emma cut him off. "Where?" "The old research facility." 1 hour. Victoria placed a keycard on the table. "Come alone, or certain documents about your father's early experiments go public." After Victoria left, Jake grabbed Emma's arm. "It's a trap, obviously," Emma agreed. But Blake wouldn't risk meeting there unless something important was still in that facility, something worth exposing himself for. "Then we do this smart," Jake said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Mason." 50 minutes later, Emma stood before the abandoned research facility. Its windows were dark, ivy crawling up the concrete walls. She touched her jacket pocket, feeling the small recording device Mason had given her. Inside, emergency lights cast a dim glow. Her footsteps echoed on the tile floor. In what used to be the main laboratory, she found Blake waiting, looking more relaxed than he had at the festival. Finally dropping the social media princess act, he asked, noting her serious expression, "Cut the games, Richard. What's this about?" Blake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your father ever tell you what we were really working on here? Before his community-first philosophy got in the way of real progress?" "You mean before you tried to turn Marshall Tech into a surveillance company?" "Surveillance?" Blake laughed. "Think bigger, goddaughter. We were developing predictive behavior technology. Imagine knowing how people would react before they did. Being able to shape their responses, their desires, their whole reality." Emma felt a chill. "Mind control, market guidance," Blake corrected. "Your social media empire was just a primitive version, influencing people through carefully curated content. We were developing ways to customize reality itself for each user. That's why Dad shut it down," Emma realized. "It wasn't just about privacy concerns." "Your father lacked vision," Blake spat. "He could have revolutionized human interaction. Instead, he buried our research and pushed this small-town technology narrative." Emma heard faint movement behind her. "Jake and Mason, right on schedule." "You're wrong about Dad's vision. The festival proved that." "The festival?" Blake scoffed. "A quaint display of outdated values. But since you're so interested in the truth," he pressed a button on his phone. Screens around the lab flickered to life, showing security footage from 20 years ago. Emma watched her father and Blake arguing in this very room. "Your father wasn't just developing community-friendly tech," Blake said. "This facility was testing behavioral modification systems. He only backed out when he saw how effective they were." "You're trying to manipulate me," Emma said, but doubt crept into her voice. "Am I? Check the servers yourself. Your father's original codes included subliminal response triggers. Everything I did later was built on his foundation." Jake stepped out of the shadows. "Like how you built your corporate empire on stolen research." Blake spun around. Mason emerged from another doorway, holding an ancient laptop. "Found what you were really after," Mason said. "The original project files, showing who really developed the behavioral modification concepts." "You did," Emma said to Blake, understanding dawning. "Dad discovered what you were doing and shut it down. That's why you've been trying to access these servers, to delete the evidence." Blake's composed facade cracked. "You think your little community festival victory means anything? I still have enough influence to what?" Emma pulled out her phone, showing the active broadcast signal. "To stop the truth from spreading. Isn't that exactly what this technology was supposed to do?" Through her phone, thousands of people were watching the confrontation live. Comments flooded in as viewers connected the dots between Blake's current social media manipulation tactics and his earlier attempts at behavioral control. "Your father was weak," Blake snarled. He could have controlled the future of human interaction. Instead, he chose to protect people's autonomy. And you've chosen the same path. No, Emma corrected him. I chose truth over manipulation, reality over curated fiction, just like Dad did. Blake lunged for Mason's laptop, but Jake intercepted him. In the struggle, more old files were displayed on the lab screens. Blake's early experiments, his attempts to patent mind manipulation technology, and David Marshall's final order to shut everything down. It's over, Richard, Emma said softly. No filters, no manipulated narratives, just the truth. Blake stared at the screens, at his exposed legacy. Then, with surprising dignity, he straightened his jacket. You really are your father's daughter, he said, before walking out of the facility. Outside, police cars were arriving, responding to calls about the break-in. But the real action was online, where the livestream had exposed decades of corporate manipulation attempts. You okay? Jake asked, noticing Emma's hands shaking. I thought coming to Pine Ridge was about learning to live without social media, she said. But it was about learning to use influence responsibly, wasn't it? Mason nodded. Your father sent you here because he saw you heading down the same path Blake had chosen, using technology to manipulate rather than connect. Emma looked at her phone, at the thousands of comments supporting Marshall Tech's original vision. Then let's show them what real connection looks like. Blake's media team launched their final assault at midnight. A professionally edited video appeared simultaneously across multiple platforms, showing carefully selected clips from the research facility confrontation. The footage was manipulated to suggest that both David and Emma Marshall had been involved in developing behavioral control technology. Emma, still at the facility with Jake and Mason, watched the video spread across social media. Her old followers, millions of them, were divided, some defending her, others expressing shock and betrayal at the apparent revelation. He's desperate, Jake said, watching the view count rise. But he still knows how to manipulate social media algorithms. Then we don't fight him on his terms, Emma replied, an idea forming. She turned to Mason. The old broadcast equipment in the facility, does it still work? Mason nodded slowly, understanding her plan. Local frequency, like we used for town emergencies. No filters, no algorithms, just direct transmission. Over the next hour, they worked to restore the facility's original communication system. Jake's mechanical expertise, combined with Mason's historical knowledge, brought the old equipment back to life. The irony wasn't lost on Emma. Using vintage technology to combat modern digital manipulation. At 1 a.m., Emma sat before the facility's original broadcast camera. No ring light, no filters, no carefully crafted backdrop, just harsh fluorescent lighting and honest intent. My name is Emma Marshall, she began, her voice transmitting across Pine Ridge and streaming through the local news station's feed. What you're about to see isn't edited, filtered, or manipulated. It's simply the truth. She played the complete security footage from 20 years ago, showing the full context of her father's decision to shut down Blake's experiments. The unedited videos revealed Blake's secret tests, his attempts to implement behavioral control without consent, and David Marshall's decisive action to protect people's autonomy. I built my life around cultivating influence, Emma continued. I measured my worth in followers, likes, and engagement rates. But here in Pine Ridge, I learned what real influence means. The local newsfeed picked up her broadcast, spreading it beyond the town's borders. Blake's carefully orchestrated video campaign began to falter as viewers compared the heavily edited version with Emma's raw footage. Richard Blake taught me how to manipulate an audience, Emma said. But Pine Ridge taught me how to connect with a community. My father didn't send me here as punishment. He sent me here to understand the difference. From the facility's entrance, Jake signaled that Blake's media team was attempting to shut down their broadcast. But they had anticipated this. Sarah's teenage son, monitoring the digital feeds, implemented the backup plan they'd prepared during the festival. a decentralized network of local transmitters, each carrying Emma's unedited message. Technology shouldn't be about control, Emma continued, her voice steady. It should be about empowerment, connection, and truth. That's what Marshall Tech was founded on, and that's what Pine Ridge reminded me of. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations across the country picked up the story. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting Marshall Tech's original vision. Blake's manipulated video was flagged and fact-checked, its artificial engagement exposed. But the most powerful response came from Pine Ridge itself. As Emma spoke, people began gathering outside the facility. Shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, students. They carried their own stories of how technology had enhanced rather than replaced their way of life. When Emma finally emerged from the facility, she found the entire town waiting. Lucy stepped forward with her laptop, showing how the authentic broadcast had overwhelmed Blake's campaign. Blake's video firm just withdrew their support, Lucy announced. They're claiming they were misled about the content. Jake put his hand on Emma's shoulder. Your followers are jumping ship too. From your old content to your live broadcast. They're choosing reality over manipulation. Emma looked at her phone one last time. Her carefully curated social media empire was transforming in real time. Comments poured in from followers, saying they felt relieved to see authentic content, to connect with real stories rather than filtered perfection. Miss Marshall, a national news reporter, approached. Would you say this experience has changed your perspective on social media influence? Emma looked at the crowd of Pine Ridge residents, at Jake's proud smile, at Mason's knowing nod. This isn't about social media, she replied. It's about choosing between using technology to control people and using it to connect them. My father made that choice 20 years ago. Tonight, I made the same one. As the sun rose over Pine Ridge, Emma's phone buzzed with a final message from Blake. You've chosen your path. Don't expect the world to thank you for it. Emma didn't bother responding. Instead, she joined the crowd of townspeople heading to Tom's diner for breakfast, ready to share real conversations without worrying about followers, engagement, or influence. Her path was clear now, not as a social media princess, but as someone who understood the true power of technology to unite rather than divide. 1 week after the broadcast, David Marshall's private jet landed at the small regional airport near Pine Ridge. Emma waited on the tarmac, Jake standing beside her. As her father descended the stairs, she noticed he looked both tired and relieved. The board meetings had been intense, David said, hugging her. Blake's resignation caused quite a stir in Silicon Valley. How bad is the fallout? Emma asked as they drove toward town. Actually, David smiled. Our stock is up. Turns out, when people learned about Marshall Tech's original mission, using technology to enhance rather than replace human connection, it resonated, especially after your broadcast. They pulled up to the diner, where Tom had reserved the back room for a private conversation. Over coffee and pie, David shared the full story. Blake's behavioral modification research didn't end when I shut down the facility, he explained. He's been implementing softer versions through social media algorithms for years. Your influence career played right into his hands, proving his theories about digital manipulation. That's why you sent me here, Emma realized. You saw me becoming what he wanted. I saw you losing yourself to the same obsession with control that consumed him, David corrected. But you found something better. Jake, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. The town's been talking about reopening the research facility, not for behavioral science, but for developing technology that actually helps small communities thrive. David's eyes lit up. That was the original dream. Before Blake twisted it, Emma leaned forward. Dad, I've been thinking. My followers, I still have millions of them, even after everything. But now they're looking for something real. What if we showed them what technology could really do? Over the next hour, they outlined a new vision for Marshall Tech. Emma would document the reopening of the facility, but not through filtered photos and sponsored content. Instead, she would show the real process of developing technology that served human needs rather than exploiting them. We'll need local input, David mused. People who understand what small communities actually need. I might know someone who's good with both people and machines, Emma said, glancing at Jake, who tried to hide his surprise. Later that afternoon, they visited the facility. Workers were already clearing the ivy, replacing broken windows, bringing the old building back to life. Sarah and her art students had painted a new sign, Marshall Tech Community Innovation Center. What exactly are you planning? Jake asked Emma as they watched the transformation. Something real, she replied. No more influence for influence's sake. We'll document the development of technology that matters. Sustainable energy solutions for small towns. Communication systems that bring people together physically instead of just virtually. Educational tools that enhance rather than replace human teaching. David approached them, looking more energized than Emma had seen him in years. The boards approved the initial funding. We're officially restarting Marshall Tech's original mission. With some updates, Emma added. Jake, how would you feel about heading up the Practical Applications Division? We need someone who understands both the technology and the community. Jake stared at her. Are you serious? You've got the skills, David said. And more importantly, you understand what we're trying to achieve here. It's not about profits or power. It's about purpose. Emma's phone buzzed. Her first social media post since the broadcast was going viral. But instead of her usual perfectly staged content, it was a simple photo of the facility's new sign with a caption, "Real influence isn't about controlling people. It's about empowering them. Welcome to the new Marshall Tech." The comments section filled with questions, support, and genuine interest in what technology could do when used for connection rather than control. Emma showed her father the response. "You were right to send me here," she said. "I needed to lose my influence to understand what real influence means." David squeezed her shoulder. "You didn't lose influence, Emma. You found its true purpose." As the sun set over Pine Ridge, Emma stood with Jake and her father, watching the facility come back to life. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel compelled to check them. The real story was happening here, in this small town that had taught her the difference between manipulation and genuine connection. "So," Jake said, ready to show the world what technology can really do. Emma looked at the community gathering to help with the renovation, at her father's proud smile, at the possibility of creating something meaningful. "No filters," she replied. "No manipulation, just real innovation for real people." David nodded approvingly. "That's the Marshall Tech I always dreamed of building." The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Emma's journey from social media princess to authentic innovator had only just begun. And this time, her influence would serve a purpose greater than likes and followers. It would help bridge the gap between technology and humanity, just as Pine Ridge had bridged the gap between her curated online persona and her true self. 2 months later, Emma stood at a podium in the Marshall Tech headquarters in Silicon Valley. The annual shareholders meeting had been transformed into something unprecedented. A direct broadcast connecting the corporate office with the newly renovated Pine Ridge facility. "Today," Emma began, "we're not just presenting quarterly earnings or market projections. We're revealing something that's been hidden for 20 years. The true story of Marshall Tech." The main screen behind her split into 2 feeds. The sleek corporate boardroom and the bustling Pine Ridge Innovation Center, where Jake supervised a team of local engineers and programmers. "But first," Emma continued, "there's someone who should be here for this." She nodded to security, who escorted Richard Blake into the room. He looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than she remembered. "My godfather taught me everything about controlling narratives," Emma said, meeting Blake's eyes. "Today, he's going to help us understand why that control was never the answer." The room tensed as Blake was invited to the podium. But instead of the expected corporate hostility, Emma displayed an old photograph on the screen. Blake and her father as young entrepreneurs, standing proudly before the original Pine Ridge facility. "Richard," Emma addressed him directly, "you once believed in the same dream my father did, before influence became more important than impact. Would you tell them what changed?" Blake stared at the photo for a long moment. Perhaps it was the weeks since his public downfall, or maybe the genuine absence of accusation in Emma's voice. But something in him shifted. "We were young," he began slowly. "The technology we were developing, it showed us patterns in human behavior we'd never seen before. David wanted to use those patterns to help people make better choices. I saw the potential to make those choices for them." The room was silent as Blake continued, describing how the allure of control had corrupted their original vision, how behavioral modification had seemed like a shortcut to technological progress. But watching Emma's transformation in Pine Ridge, Blake admitted, "I saw what David understood 20 years ago. Real progress isn't about control, it's about connection." Emma returned to the podium. "Marshall Tech isn't just changing its direction, we're returning to our original purpose." She gestured to the Pine Ridge feed, where Jake and his team were demonstrating their first new project, a community-based renewable energy system that had already reduced the town's power costs by 40%. "But this isn't just about technology," Emma continued. "It's about trust, which is why today we're releasing everything, the complete history of Marshall Tech, including the behavioral modification research." David stood up from his seat. "We're also announcing a new ethical framework for technological development, one that prioritizes human autonomy and community enhancement over data collection and behavioral control." Blake watched as years of corporate manipulation were exposed and transformed into a template for responsible innovation. His face showed a mix of resignation and, surprisingly, relief. The shareholders, initially skeptical, were won over by the practical results from Pine Ridge. The stock price, instead of plummeting with the revelations, steadily climbed as investors recognized the potential of technology that enhanced rather than exploited human connection. After the meeting, Emma found Jake waiting in the lobby. "Ready for Phase 2? he asked. Emma smiled. Phase 2 was their plan to extend Pine Ridge's innovations to other small communities, creating a network of local technology centers focused on practical solutions rather than data harvesting. "First," she said, "there's something I need to do." She approached Blake, who stood alone by the window. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping us tell the truth." Blake turned to her. "Your father was right to send you to Pine Ridge. You found what I lost there, the understanding that influence without purpose is just another form of control." As they left the building, Emma's phone buzzed with a new kind of notification. The Pine Ridge Innovation Center had just released its first open-source project, a community-based social platform that prioritized real-world connections over virtual engagement. "Your old followers are already signing up," Jake reported. "They're tired of algorithms telling them what to think and feel. They want something real." Emma looked at her father, who was deep in conversation with Sarah about expanding the art program to include technological integration. She watched Blake walking away, perhaps to begin his own journey of redemption, and she felt Jake's hand slip into hers, a reminder of the authentic connections that had changed her life. "You know," she said, "when Dad first sent me to Pine Ridge, I thought I was losing everything, my influence, my platform, my voice. But I wasn't losing anything. You were finding your purpose," Jake finished. Emma nodded, watching as the sun set behind the corporate towers of Silicon Valley. Tomorrow, they would return to Pine Ridge, where real innovation was happening in garages and community centers, in conversations around dinner tables, and in collaborative projects that put people before profits. Her phone buzzed one last time, a message from Lucy. "The next generation of Marshall Tech interns arrives tomorrow, ready to show them what real influence looks like." Emma smiled. The story that had begun as her exile had become something much more. A revolution in how technology could serve humanity rather than control it. And it had all started in a small town where likes didn't matter, filters didn't work, and real connections changed everything. "Let's go home," she said to Jake. "We've got work to do."